Hi, and welcome to the program. I'm Bob Crimmins, and this is Living in the West. And this is the television version of the magazine Living in the West that has been around for the past 25 years, of which you can pick up a free copy at all kinds of magazine racks out there. You can go to Safeway grocery stores, Lebu coffee shops, etc., etc. It's in like almost 500 magazine racks out there, and you can pick yourself up a copy. You can also go over to livinginthewest.com and you can read the whole magazine over there. You can go into the archives. You can look at some of the past articles that I wrote about history, and I really enjoy history a lot. And I came across an article some time ago about trains, and everybody likes trains, of course. And I thought I'd share this story about how the Transcontinental Railroad got started. And as you know, before that happened, we had wagon trains, and it would take 6 months to get across the country. And after the train came in, then it took about 6 days to get across the country. So a big difference there. And our whole country, obviously, is totally different just because of the Transcontinental Railroad. So I'd like to introduce my guest. He's from down there where it's really nice at that big old train depot of ours downtown there, where you can take your kids in there and you can spend 6 hours walking around looking at trains. We're very lucky to have the train museum here in Sacramento. And his name is Kyle Wyatt, and he's graciously enough said he'd come on and talk, and he brought a lot of pictures with him. So you're going to see what did it look like when they were actually building the Transcontinental Railroad. So at this time, thank you for joining me.
Thank you very much.
Appreciate it very much. And yes, this is quite a story, and you know the story better than anybody I know.
Sure, and as you say, I brought a lot of pictures to talk about the building of the railroad, especially getting across the mountains, which was the big challenge that they had. So let's take a look at the pictures that we brought. Initially, we started out transit, as you said, was by wagon.
Right.
It was long and arduous. It was not just across the country, but even to supply the mines in Virginia City, up in Idaho and Montana. They would have wagon trains that would haul all the supplies up and over the mountains. And one of the roads was the Dutch Flat and Donner Wagon Road that was built over Donner Pass. A couple of pictures here that show that that route and the wagons that were on there hauling up all the supplies, the mining supplies, the food, all the tooling, because California was a major source of supplies with the foundries as well as food supplies to haul that in. And of course, in the winter, you'd have the challenge of the snowbanks. As you can see here, even late into the spring, the snow would still be up in the mountains. So they wanted to build a railroad to speed all of that up. Ground was broken in Sacramento in January of 1863, and this is a representation of that groundbreaking ceremony. They built it on the levee in Sacramento, and they actually took dirt out of a wagon and put it on the ground for the ceremony because they're building up a levee to stop the flooding. They built it on the levee because they could have shipping to bring the supplies up from San Francisco, but then to transfer to the railroad in Sacramento to haul it further east. They had formerly hauled it by wagons, so they built right there in Old Sacramento, what today is Old Sacramento. They built freight depots. They built a passenger depot that you see here. We have reconstructed that passenger depot in Old Sacramento. But this was the launching pad, if you will, for building the Transcontinental Railroad. From here, the track headed east and faced all kinds of barriers to get that constructed. One of the first big barriers that they had to cross was the American River. They actually built this bridge right here across the American River. Today there is the successor bridge pretty much right in the very same spot out near Cal Expo. You can see that bridge, and this was one of the first big things to tell people that they're really building a railroad when permanent structures like that get built. From there, they went on up to Rockland. They built a large roundhouse in Rockland because this is the beginning of the real grade, so they had to have helper locomotives to pull the loads up over. From there, they went on up to Newcastle, and this was a major benchmark because by the time they got to Newcastle, they could actually start hauling freight on the railroad, and the wagons and stagecoaches would meet the end of the railroad and haul from there. But from there on up to Auburn, they would actually haul the stuff from Sacramento up there and then transfer it to the wagons and the stages. In building the railroad, there are a number of different types of challenges they faced. We talked briefly about the bridges. Here's the American River Bridge again. But up in the mountains, there were a lot more bridges of rivers and streams that had to be crossed. The Long Ravine Trestle, just east of Colfax, was a major achievement. This aerial view is a huge structure. When you look down from the ground and look up, you can see how high up in the air that thing sticks. And they had to really build across the big gullies. They were building fast. They were trying to build as rapidly as possible, and there was lots of wood, so the wood structures like these were much faster than filling in with dirt. This is a picture of the Secret Town Trestle further up in the mountains. They later came back in and filled that in with dirt, but in the initial construction, it was all out of wood. In building the bridges, such as this one, they used what are called Howe truss bridges, but on the long spans, over 200 feet long, they would also build in an arch to give it more support, to help carry the heavy loads. Again, here's a close-up of the interior of one of those bridges with the arch. Building on down the Truckee River Canyon, there were a series of crossings of the Truckee River that they had to build bridges for on the way down into Nevada. As I say, the Sierra Nevadas were viewed as the major obstacle. Many people didn't believe it would be possible to build a railroad across the mountains, but they proved it was possible. They built all of these structures in a few short years. Again, coming across. In addition to the streams, of course, the other thing was cutting through the banks and the ridges. One of the first big cutting obstacles was what's called Bloomer Cut. And this was hard aggregate cement. When you go up there today, you can still see this. It's still very narrow, looks very much like this. But I recommend not going into the cut because it's very narrow and it would be very dangerous when the trains come by. But you can go up there and see that today, still looking very similar. In building the cuts, what they try and do, they do cuts and fills. The idea is you don't want to haul the dirt very far, so you cut through a ridge and by hand you load it into these horse carts, and then you carry it out a little ways and then you dump it to fill in across the ravines. And so all of this is hand labor, using black powder to blast with, loading up the one-horse carts, hauling them out, and then dumping the dirt to carry the railroad across the ravines. This was arduous work and backbreaking. This is a picture of Dixie Cut under construction, and you can see all the carts out there. The train has come up to the end of track, and in the background you can see the construction. And then here we'll see what it looks like once it's complete. This is the very same view, the very same cut after the railroad is completed. They've just finished. You can still see the carts there to the side. Building up into the mountains, sometimes they could do cuts. One of the most famous is up at a place called Cape Horn, where there's this grand overlook of the American River Canyon. You can see high up on the mountains the route of the railroad. The result was a grand view down into the American River Canyon. Trains would actually stop here and passengers get out to take a look at this grand view. The traditional story is that in building this, they hung Chinese workers in baskets over the edge of the cliff. Well, most of those accounts seem to be 20th century. The Chinese were instrumental in building the railroad, but it does not seem that they actually hung them in baskets at Cape Horn. In addition to the cuts, sometimes the ridges were high enough that they would actually have to build tunnels to get through the ridges. And the mother of all tunnels was up at the summit, at Donner Summit, where they had a huge tunnel that they had to build. This actually took them nearly 2 years to construct through the hard granite. Here you can see the wagon road approach and the beginning of the cutting of the tunnel. At each end, they would start digging and blasting and to build the tunnel, but they would sometimes measure progress in inches per day. In this aerial view, you can look down and see the railroad as it's being constructed with the stonework across the ravines for carrying the track. On the summit tunnel, they actually bored a shaft down at the top. This picture is the shaft house. So they actually bored down to the level of the tunnel and then built out from there. So they had 4 faces to try and cut through the tunnel all the time at the same time. They could have 4 crews working at one time. Even so, it took nearly 2 years to build. Again, at the ends, using the horse carts to haul out the material. This is a view inside the tunnel while it's under construction. And you can see this is all carved out initially with black powder, and the progress was so slow they actually started using nitroglycerin, which was very explosive but also very, very dangerous. The crews who were drilling the holes through the mountains were Chinese workers. They used hand drills. One man would hold the drill steel, the other would swing with a sledgehammer, and that's how they would bore the holes to put in the black powder or the nitroglycerin. There were also support people, a Chinese tea carrier to provide refreshments to the workers so that they could keep working all the way through. And even building the summit tunnel, they then had this big granite face that they had to build through up above Donner Lake. While they're building the tunnels, the railroad stopped at a place called Cisco, just down the hill a little bit. And this, for almost 2 years, was the transfer point for the stagecoaches and the wagons hauling freight. In addition, they hauled a locomotive on sleds in the winter down to Truckee and built new railroad down the Truckee River Canyon so they could keep moving forward even while they're still trying to finish the tunnel up there. One of the big challenges they discovered, they thought that they could keep in the winter, keep the line open with snow plows. And so they had these big bucker plows that would push the snow away, but they hadn't counted on how deep the snow was in the high Sierras and how heavy that snow is. For cross-country skiers, we know it as Sierra cement. It's so wet and heavy. So fairly quickly, they learned that bucking plows and shoveling out was not going to keep the railroad open. They actually had to build coverings because the snow was so deep and so heavy. So this is the origin of the snow plows. You can see how deep this is. The engine house, the turntable, the locomotive are almost buried in the snow. It's so deep up there at Cisco in this picture. So they actually build sheds over the tracks, snow sheds. This was railroading in a barn, is what they called it. Most of the snow sheds were a sort of an A-frame shape. They would take logs and strip the bark off and build this A-frame like in this picture. You can see some of the framework. They would then put a roof and sides on that with boards to protect it. Most of the sheds here, again, you can see before they put the siding and the roofing on, and you can see the framework and the round logs that they're using just to make these sheds. Sometimes, though, they had double tracks, and they would build a shed over 2 tracks instead of 1, so an extra wide shed, and then even taller A-frame roof, as you can see here. again, hand built. They would have to lift the beams in place and cut them into place. On the steep cliffs, they built a different type of shed where they would actually tie it into the cliff face. This is because they would have the snow slides that would come down from the higher mountains, and the sheds had to be able to carry the snow across the track. So they built these very, very heavy timbered sheds and roofs, and then they would tie them with rods, tie them back into the cliff so they would stay in place. All very much building as they went and designing as they went. They went through a series of experiments to try and find the sheds that would work. But eventually they did manage to get through the mountains and out into the plains of Nevada. Nevada, while it's not flat, was much easier. Here we see Reno and the beginning of the race across the desert. By this time they were in a real race because the Union Pacific Railroad was building from the east, and each railroad was trying to see how much track they could lay because they were getting support and subsidies for how much miles they laid, but also the further they got, the more traffic they would get and the other person would not get. In building the railroad, they actually had to lay the rails, they had to bend the rails before they put them in. In addition to laying all the rails, they had to string telegraph lines for communication. Here, a picture from the work train with the telegraph poles going up on the left-hand side. They had to build other infrastructure. Here, they're building water tanks to supply the steam locomotives with water as they run along. All of this is hand construction. They could do some prefabrication, but the assembly work would be on site. They lived in tents and a work train, and particularly going across Nevada, where they were building several miles each day, the camps had to be very mobile. Again, the Chinese camps, you can see here, most of the workers, probably 3/4 of the workers were Chinese, the others were white. And across Nevada, they also employed a lot of the local native Indians in constructing. But the goal was to meet the Union Pacific, and finally on May 10th, 1869, here's the train going to the Gold Spike ceremony that was at Promontory Summit in Utah. This is what the photographer could see of the ceremony because everybody wanted to cluster around and get in close. They had the telegraph hooked up. When the railroad was completed, the telegraph message was sent from coast to coast, the first nationwide instantaneous media event, and it started celebrations from New York to San Francisco, Washington, Chicago. Here, after the ceremony, with all of the completion, we have some remnants today, even today, from that earlier time. The locomotive C.P. Huntington, which was the number 3 locomotive on the Central Pacific, became the mascot for the Southern Pacific Railroad and is now the icon of the California State Railroad Museum. And here it is on display today. It later became Southern Pacific Locomotive Number 1. Central Pacific Locomotive Number 1 was named the Governor Stanford. Leland Stanford was the president of the Central Pacific Railroad. Here's a picture of that locomotive in its early days in construction, and we now have it on display also at the California State Railroad Museum in a complete walk-in diorama that talks about the building of the Transcontinental Railroad. This is the actual original number 1 locomotive of the Central Pacific, still with us today. The Railroad Museum has many other displays. The massive cab ahead locomotive, which was the very last steam locomotive built for the Southern Pacific, is on display in the museum. We also have diesel locomotives. This daylight painted locomotive is pictured on our excursion railroad, where we sometimes operate it. We have a passenger train that goes a little ways down the river that you can ride. Here you can see the first class observation car. ready to leave the station. We also have passenger coaches. You can buy tickets in the summer on weekends to ride the train. So that's a little look at the railroad and the Railroad Museum. So let's talk a little bit.
Sakes, what a story. We're going to be sending this out, as I told you earlier, to fourth grade school teachers because they teach their students history in that grade.
Yes.
And we're going to send it along with the Bear Flag Revolt and a couple of other programs that we've put together. And that was, I want you to tell you, that was so informative. I mean, that really gives you a taste of what they had to go through, where it started, what they had to go through, and some of the problems that they came up, and they came up on millions of problems, I'm sure. They were like overwhelming. Like today, we probably would have said, we can't do it, it's too hard.
Well, and we would spend years studying it.
Yes, we would study this thing to death, and it never would have gotten done.
So in those days, of course, they had different sensitivities. They viewed natural resources as being infinite, that those are readily available, that they are everywhere, and so they would just consume those. They didn't worry about those. We now know that they actually are limited resources, and we have to be a little more careful with that. So the study is not completely inappropriate, but it certainly slows things down.
I had read where you were talking about nitroglycerin, and they did start to use that stuff, but they found out it was too dangerous, and so they quit and went back to black powder or something like that. They just couldn't keep up with the nitro.
Well, the nitroglycerin can be very unstable. One of the things that they did, they had a very good safety record using it, and one of the reasons is instead of manufacturing and then hauling it up into the mountains, a lot of times that was where the real danger was.
Right.
They actually built a chemistry factory up at the summit, and they hired a chemist, and they made that nitroglycerin on site.
Interesting. I didn't know that.
So they actually had a very good safety record with it. And this at a time when the nation had become very aware of the dangers of nitroglycerin. There had been some nitroglycerin shipped around Cape Horn and up to San Francisco that was unstable and blew up and completely destroyed the Wells Fargo office in San Francisco just a couple of years earlier. And so there was a lot of worry and paranoia. Another reason that they built the factory up on the ridge was that California was putting restrictions on transporting nitroglycerin because it was so dangerous.
Okay. Those sheds up there that you're showing us that they built over the tracks.
The snow sheds,
Yeah.
yes.
Are some of those that are up there now those same, or did those all cave in and they built new ones up there, or what?
Well, the wood, of course, has a lifespan, and they replaced sheds. They also improved designs over the years. So over the years, there was a lot of replacement of sheds.
So those sheds, if we were up there and they were going through the shed on a train, going up to Reno or something, we're not going through the same shed.
It's not the same building, but it's the same place.
Could be the same lumber, or
no, the
same
lumber
locations.
And what's more, all of the wooden sheds have now been replaced. The remaining sheds are all concrete. So they've replaced the last of the wooden sheds in the 1980s. But even those were not the original 1860s wood. Because the wood, will last 15 years or 20 years, and then you have to replace it because it doesn't last forever.
You know, that whole industry that they were putting together about putting that transcontinental railroad through there, and obviously one of the reasons they did it was because of money, and they wanted to make a lot of money, and they had gold out here, and people back there wanted it, and people out here wanted what they had out here, and it wasn't too easy getting together on all that kind of stuff. So, but when they were doing that, and I'm sure they didn't even think about this, but they were destroying another whole industry, the wagon train industry. And there were guys that made wagons, and there were people who stocked wagons, and there were people that did a lot of things, and now all of a sudden their whole industry is just wiped out.
Well, not quite wiped out, but it's changed and more restricted. So the long distance hauling gets replaced by the railroads, but you still have to haul from the railhead to the mines and things like that. So there's still trucking going on. And then, and stagecoaches also. The trains don't go everywhere. So the wagons and the stagecoaches become subsidiary or feeders to carry you to the final destination.
So where did it go from Sacramento to Promontory, Utah, and so forth? Now, from Promontory, Utah, and they were coming this direction, where did it go to exactly? Was it St. Joseph, Missouri?
Well, the wagon roads, many of them had started at St. Joseph. The Union Pacific started from Omaha, Nebraska, right across the river from Council Bluffs, Iowa.
Okay.
And so that was the beginning there. And then from that point, they connect on through to Chicago, and then from there connect through to the East Coast.
So the Transcontinental Railroad is the same one that eventually went to Chicago and back to New York.
And the interesting thing is we talk about the Transcontinental Railroad, but it's actually a network of railroads.
Oh,
there's multiple
okay.
railroads, and different companies own different pieces of that.
Oh, I see.
So you have the Central Pacific that is between Sacramento, eventually San Francisco, and from there going on to initially Promontory, then Ogden, Utah is where the final junction was. The Union Pacific then went from Ogden to Omaha. In Omaha, they met with about 3 or 4 other railroads that were coming from Chicago. So you had the Burlington Road, you had the Chicago Northwestern, you had the Rock Island Road, all of these. And then from Chicago, they met additional railroads that would carry on to the East Coast. New York Central, Pennsylvania Railroad, Erie Railroad. So it's a network. And then, of course, they build in other directions, too. So it really is sort of a lattice work of railroads that have a number of different transfer points where you can transfer cars between railroads.
Well, you know, you were showing some trains that you have down there at the museum. But I read, you know those 2 trains back there in Promontory, Utah, the picture, the famous picture of them? Those 2 were destroyed and melted down and for the war effort, and a lot of the tracks that they had laid then were ripped up for the material for the war effort too. Is that how it went?
The locomotives, like any vehicle, has a normal lifespan.
Yeah, but what would those 2 trains be worth today? Billions of dollars.
Well, they were the significant items. You know, we do, as I showed you, we have several of the locomotives from those, and they're priceless artifacts. The Governor Sanford, the #1 locomotive of the Central Pacific Railroad, and the C.P. Huntington, the other locomotive, which was the 3rd Central Pacific locomotive and became the #1 Southern Pacific locomotive.
Right.
So those things are really priceless artifacts. You can't put a price on those.
Right, of course not.
And the National Park Service now has a site up at Promontory for the Gold Spike ceremony, and they have had replica locomotives built of the 2 that were nose to nose up there.
And so why haven't we in Sacramento replicated that shovel full of dirt stuff, right, where that new sign has been put up? Why don't you guys do that? Have the people all dress up in costume and act the whole thing out, and people would love that.
Well, we have done living history events in the past, and we expect to in the future. Of course, it takes organization and structure, and it's a matter of choices of where you put your time in.
But you know, that area right there in Old Sacramento is one of the most historic places in the whole United States of America.
It's one of the reasons that we put up the sign for the groundbreaking.
Yes, I know, but after many years of begging to have it put up. But nevertheless, people would stand there, you know, and I'd say to them, you know you're standing on one of the most historic places in the country? No, what is this here? And I'd say, well, this is where it all started and blah, 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 like that, you know. And then that sign went up. Boy, was I glad to see that come up. Now at least I got a rough idea. But now if we could just do a thing where we reenacted it out and showed people that, I bet you that would be a big hit down there.
Well, and you know, in Gold Rush days, a lot of what that's about is rekindling that.
Do you look like Leland Stanford by any chance? You can play the part or something? I don't know. Listen, that's it. We're kind of done here, and I can't thank you enough for coming and bringing all the wonderful pictures and showing it. And I really learned lots myself, and I'm sure all those young people and those folks out there watching this on television for the first time have learned about the Transcontinental Railroad. So, well, before I say goodbye here, I want to show people here real quick. This is Living in the West magazine, and as you can see, it's got a big 25 on the cover, and they've been in print for 25 years right around this territory here where you're at. So go out there to one of those magazine racks at Safeway or Lebu Coffee Shop or wherever you go, and look for a copy of it. It's free, and I write an article in here every month, and I've got a real good one in here this month about bald-headed eagles and so forth. And you can go to the archives. You just go over to livinginthewest.com, and then you can hit the archives button and you can go over and you can see some of the other history articles, I should say, that I wrote for the magazine and so forth. So I want to thank all of you out there for joining us today, and I want to thank Kyle for joining us, and thank you very much, Kyle.
A pleasure.
Yes, I've learned a lot today, so you join us again next time here, and in the meantime, thanks for joining us this time. See you.